As my truck continued up the dirt path through the endless sea of trees, I began to feel that familiar, excited anticipation, knowing I was returning to my favorite place on Earth. I had been the sole occupant of this fire lookout for the last 10 summers, and still, every time I look out on the expanse of wilderness around me, I am struck by the sheer beauty and isolation of it. The towering pines surround me as the wind carries bird songs and the sounds of nature into my window. The walls of green next to me teeming with life. The nearest person or town is miles behind me now, and I feel at peace in the isolation. My trance is broken as I see the fire lookout peek its head from over the treetops, its weathered wooden face seeming to stare back at me, inviting me home. As my truck pulls to a stop, I grab my duffel bag and head to the cabin located at the base of the tower. I gently push open the old oak door with a familiar creak. I am greeted by the damp, musty air inside. I throw my bag onto the bare mattress and head back out front to begin ferrying the rest of my provisions to the cabin. As I set down the last of my provisions, I slide the thick wool curtain open, allowing the beams of sunlight to stream in and illuminate the dust particles drifting in the air. I begin the work of unpacking, putting my sheets on the bed and placing my clothes in the large wooden dresser that sits beside it. Once my provisions had been safely packed away, I step back out into the forest and head up the stairs to the tower. As I climb up the ancient wooden steps, I look around at the ocean of wilderness that surrounds me, seeing nothing but the rolling alpine forests and the Cascades in the distance. Having lived in Washington all my life, I was familiar with the ecosystems and lands that surrounded my tower, but they still filled me with awe every time I was in them. The lush, thick green seeming to put me in another world, one without the worries of day-to-day life and without the stresses that came with living around people and their creations. There is an almost meditative quality to being isolated and surrounded by nothing but nature. I arrive to the top of the stairs and push open the weathered wooden door, greeted by that same damp, musty air inside. The inside of the lookout was the same as I had left it, everything in its place. I made the small cot and then I climbed onto the roof of the lookout to check the solar panels that had been installed a few years previously. They looked to be clear of debris or damage, so as I entered the lookout once again, I radioed the forestry station that covered this area to inform them I had arrived at my tower. They radio back soon after, and I opened the windows of the tower to allow the cool early summer air to blow through, carrying the smells and sounds of the landscape around me. I sit on my cot and begin to read one of the many books I had brought along on this journey. I had arrived in the early afternoon, and now as the evening was approaching, so was the blue sky above me darkening with an approaching storm. I put my book down and closed the windows of the tower. I began to scan my surroundings, being sure to watch for any trails of smoke, as the lightning brought with the storm was liable to start a small wildfire. The hours passed, the storm came and went with no fires to be seen. Now the sun was dipping below the trees, painting the sky a gorgeous amber color with streaks of pinks, reds, and purples. I stepped outside the door of my tower onto the platform that encircled it and looked out at the landscape, now painted in a soft blue with everything slowly darkening, making way for the dazzling display of lights that was the night sky this far removed from the lights of humanity. I sat there admiring the stars and galaxies filling the sky around me for what seemed like hours until I decided to head down the spiral of stairs to my cabin. I flipped the light switch on the wall, turning on the sole light that hung in the center of the room. I began to cook myself dinner and sat at the desk in front of the window of the cabin, peering out into the dim light as I ate. As I lie in bed after tidying up and turning out the lights, I begin to feel myself drifting to sleep, listening to the gentle music of the forest around me. Before I could fully slip into my dreams, though, I hear what sounds to be footsteps slowly ascending the aged wooden stairs to my lookout. Slightly confused as to what could be making the noise, I get up out of my sheets and slide on my boots. I grab my .22 rifle and a flashlight and head out the front door. The melodies played only moments ago by the wilds around me seemed to cease, leaving only an eerily still forest as I step into the cool night air. I begin to walk up into the tower, the whole while looking for the source of the footsteps I had heard from my bed. I reach the top of the tower, only to be greeted by an empty lookout, with nothing there to explain the noise. My perplexed state is broken by the sound of someone running down the tower a few flights below me. Peek my head over the edge of the railing to see the stairs below me, only to see them empty. The noise had stopped as soon as it had begun, leaving me equally uneasy and confused. I start back down the stairs, being mindful of my surroundings and straining to hear anything other than my own breath and footsteps. The stairs creak under my weight with each step I take, each creak raising my anxiety until I feel like I want to crawl out of my own skin. I reach the bottom and look around, seeing nothing but the darkness of the trees around me, seeming to loom even taller now, feeling almost sinister in their nature. I head back into my cabin, being sure to close the deadbolt once inside. I lie back down under my sheets and drift into an uneasy sleep. I wake up as the sunlight drifts through the still air of my cabin onto me, slowly stirring me from the fitful sleep I had fallen into. I sit up in bed, rubbing my eyes as I stand up and head for the kitchen. I begin to think back to the night before, confused as to what could have caused the sounds I had heard. I finish breakfast and decide to get some firewood, as the few logs I had left up here last year now had been used, and I would not have any way to cook myself dinner come nightfall. I wander out into the thick foliage of my little island in the ocean of trees, the sounds of birds and other animals filling the air around me as I collect the offerings of the wilderness I call home. I start back to my cabin after an hour or so, the anxiety and apprehension of the night before having left me. I soak in the tranquility of my surroundings, smelling the moist pine-scented air, the soft moss beneath my boots cushioning each footfall. The morning air blew onto my face gently. Enveloped in the joy of it all, I break into the clearing and set my firewood in the covered area behind my cabin. I begin to climb up the tower, bringing my book and journal with me. I step through the wooden door and open the windows yet again, allowing the soft currents and eddies of air to fill my lookout. I begin to draw my surroundings in the journal, filling it with the beauty of the mountains and pines around. As the afternoon sun began to slowly arc lower in the sky, I spot a small trail of smoke in the distance to the south of me. Its gentle stream indicating the start of a wildfire, I radioed the forestry station and informed them of its location. An hour passes by, and I see the smoke slowly getting darker, and it begins to take up more space in the sky around me, until I see it slowly being pushed back, until it is no longer there. The sky painted with watercolor once again. I begin back down to the cabin. I grab 2 logs from the stack of wood collected earlier that day and head inside. Begin to cook myself dinner and make the decision to sleep in the tower tonight. After eating, I grab an extra blanket and ascend the lookout once again. I stand on the edge of the railing, staring out into the world around me, being serenaded by the orchestra of night sounds encircling me. As I look down to the forest floor below, the orchestra refrains, and I am greeted by a disconcerting sight. At the edge of my clearing there is a person, illuminated by the moon's rays. The woods around the strange figure appear to be darker than should be possible, as if the shadows are coalescing behind this thing, making it all the more visible in the moonlight. The person looks up at me with a sharp movement, seeming almost inhuman, with a hauntingly large smile painted on their pale skin. The person appears to be dressed in a tattered ranger uniform, one of days long past. While I am frozen in a state of shock, the stranger backs into the trees, the whole while looking into my very being, moving unnaturally with movements jerky and stiff, as if they were breaking their bones just to walk back into the unknown. Broken from my trance, I race down the tower toward the tree line below, seeming to glide over the steps rather than hitting them. As I reach the place this figure had occupied only moments ago, I am greeted by nothing but empty forest. I call out, imploring whoever is there to show themselves, but to no avail. Unnerved and at a loss for words, I head back to the tower and lie in my cot. As I stare at the worn-down boards above me, the sounds of nature returned, slowly lulling me into a restless sleep. I wake in the morning to the sunrise painting the inside of my tower with a soft light as I rub the sleep out of my eyes and stand up. I am greeted by the same view that has drawn me into this place. However, it feels tainted now, unsettling given the events of the previous night. I decide to go out into the isolation and search for any evidence of the apparition that had haunted me the night before. Grabbing some provisions as well as the rifle from my cabin, I cautiously walk into the woods to begin my investigation. Starting from where the figure had walked back into the woods, I scoured every inch of the ground and shrubs around the spot looking for anything at all, only to find nothing. I continued this way for hours, widening the area that was combed over, only to come back with empty hands and no proof this whole ordeal had not been a terrible dream. That night I decided that I would continue sleeping in the tower with the hopes of seeing the figure again. I sat at the railing of the tower, drinking in the night air. I scanned the tree line, searching for any hint of whatever had visited me the night prior. However, I was greeted with only the shadows of the pines swimming around me. There is no sign of anything amiss, and I retire to my cot, falling into a long, dreamless sleep. For the following week, there was no figure in the woods or strange noises at night. There was only the constant shifting melody of the forest and my normal day-to-day tasks. Despite the return of the calm around me, as I sat in my cabin to prepare dinner for the day, I heard a knock on the cabin door. I sat paralyzed at my stove, staring at the windowless slab of oak that sat in front of me. There was no reason for anyone to have come this far into the mountains at this hour. I slowly set down the pot I had been moving and crept toward the window next to the door. I pulled the curtains aside and cautiously peered out into the night. My vision turned to the right, focusing on the porch in front of my door. There was no sign of anything there. My eyes panned around, seeking for an answer in the night around me. I was given this answer, though it was not a welcome one. In the tree line in front of me stood the same figure as before. As he was much closer this time than during my previous encounter, I could make out his shoulder-length brown hair, matted and dirty, framing an equally worn face, ghostly pale in the moonlight. Two wells of black staring back at me. The same sinister, unearthly smile torn onto his face. His limbs appear at this closer distance to be broken and bent at odd angles, his clothing torn and bloody as if he had run through a bramble patch. Despite the dread welling inside me, my attention was stolen by the figure next to him, this one of a woman, slightly smaller in stature than the man next to her. She is dressed in the typical attire one would expect from a hiker this deep into the wilderness, yet as I stare at the woman, soaking in details, I notice there is a large gash across her stomach, painting the dark clothing around it even darker. There is also hints of what appear to be her intestines peeking out from the large wound, glistening in the soft glow of the moon. Her face sat there, framed by her long blonde hair that appeared to glitter in the rays of soft white light. The dark wells of her eyes, juxtaposed by the bright white of her teeth that were shown in a similarly wide and unsettling smile. Every fiber of my being wanted me to burst out of my cabin and confront these things that stared back at me. Even so, I was unable to move, as if my body was frozen in time, forced only to see what was happening, unable to intervene. As these thoughts race through my head, I see the figures begin to back into the woods, the whole while never breaking their focus on my face. The man breaking as he moves, much like the night before, and the woman seeming to limp backwards. The figures disappear into the ocean of black around them, and my trance-like state is broken. I grab my rifle and rush out into the night to chase down whatever I had just seen. As I near the tree line, I am overcome with this horrible, unshakable dread. It feels as though my very soul is trying to tear me back to the safety of the cabin and keep me from reaching whatever danger may be in the unknown. I am dragged back into the light of the cabin by whatever force had taken over my body. I pull the curtains closed once more and lay down into my cot, prepared for another sleepless night. As the morning sun fights to peer through my curtains, I stand up once more, not having been graced by the release of sleep since laying down hours ago. As I allow the morning light to win its battle, I make the decision that I will make the 2-hour journey back to the nearest town today in order to search for answers. I climb into my truck and turn the key. The engine sputters to life, and I begin the long ride back down through the endless expanse of trees and hills towards civilization. My truck rolls to a gentle stop in front of the small-town library, and I relieve my truck of the exertion it had been subjected to for the long, arduous trip back down the mountain. I pull out my cell phone that is of little use to me on the tall peak I call home for the summer. I call the one person I thought may have answers, in the form of the man I had taken on the task of keeping the tower from, an older gentleman who had spent his whole life in the mountains around me. The phone rings for a few moments, until the other side crackles to life with his familiar voice greeting me. Not knowing what exactly to say, I just swallow the anxious lump in my throat and begin with the story of what I had been experiencing for the last few weeks alone on that peak. As I finish telling the man of the strange experiences I had endured, and ask him if he had ever experienced anything in his many years in that tower that could decipher these happenings, he lets out a long sigh, one that seems to contain more stories than can be spoken for fear of remembering how it felt to experience them. As he begins to speak, I sit in anticipation of any answers he may provide. He tells me he had seen them during his last summer on the mountain. He speaks of how he had almost gone mad trying to find the figures, and says that after many hours of searching he discovered from a local in town that he trusted that one of the figures seemed to match the description of a local park ranger that had gone missing decades ago while searching for a missing child. His body was never to be found or laid to rest. I thank the man for his kindness in helping my search for answers, and end the call with a gentle press on my finger. I step out into the warm afternoon air and walk up the sun-soaked steps of the small library. I walk into the old wooden room and am greeted by the scent of old books, accompanied by a gentle silence enveloping the inside of the building. I head to the counter and am greeted by an older man sitting behind the desk, his wrinkled face seeming to have been carved by the passage of time to resemble the canyons and the hills around us. His kind eyes are framed behind a pair of glasses, visibly well-loved for many years, his smile hidden away beneath the large white mustache that lived on his face. As I approach the man and ask where I could find old newspapers and such from the area, his response is quiet, almost as if he had an apprehension to breaking the silence that sat around us. He informs me that there was a separate room in the back of the building to keep them safe from any idle hands that may be passing through the library. As he stands up, I can almost hear his bones creaking and struggling to keep the man upright, having been worn down by decades of hard labor in the forests that surrounded the island of civilization we sat in. He guides me through the many aisles of books that fill the space until we reach a small, inconspicuous door in the rear of the building. He fumbles with the many keys he has attached to his belt until he picks the right one out of the jumble of metal. The key clicks into the door's lock, and as he turns the key, he pushes the door open to reveal a small room with a table and chair in the center, surrounded by walls covered in shelves and drawers filled with local history. I thank the man for his time and begin the long task of searching for answers. I start by looking at the newspapers in the area from the time the park ranger had went missing. I search through the week's worth of headlines from the small, now defunct local paper. I finally reveal a headline related to the disappearance and dig into the article. It speaks of how a local boy who had been aged only 5 years old at the time had been on a hike through one of the many local trails with his family. His mother turned her back for only a moment to address the other child. In the time it took for her to chastise the boy's sister, he had disappeared, as when she turned back around to where the boy had been only moments before, she was met with an empty trail and no sign of her son. Immediately assuming her son had simply wandered into the surrounding brambles in search of blackberries, the woman begins calling her son's name and searching frantically for any traces of where he may have wandered off to. After a short while of searching, she had not found anything, and being the days before cell phones or anything of the sort, she grabbed the other child and took off down the trail in search of help. When she reached the ranger station that was at the base of the trail, she informed the rangers of what had happened. They immediately got into contact with the local sheriff and organized a search party. By nightfall, only a few short hours later, the search party was in full swing, having gotten almost every member of the local community, as well as hound dogs, onto the trail. As the sun set, the search continued for a few more hours, hoping beyond hope to find the boy that had seemed to vanish out of thin air. There was no scent trail or evidence pointing to him having walked off, almost as if he had simply been plucked out of existence by some otherworldly force. One of the members of this search party happened to be a local ranger by the name of Josiah Elders. A man in his late 30s at the time of the disappearance, he had worked for the Park Service for most of his adult life. He had an intimate knowledge of the lands that surrounded him. During the search, Josiah had been one of the few rangers assigned to go farther up the trail and cut off into the woods in order to widen the search area. He had last been seen shortly before nightfall by one of the sheriff's deputies that was organizing the search. As the search party began to return to town, distraught at not having found the missing child, knowing what a night in the woods would mean for such a young and unprepared boy, they did a head count to assess if any stragglers were left searching in the woods. This head count revealed that Josiah Elders had not returned from the search. The locals, knowing his experience and adeptness to outdoor survival, decided it would be easier to wait till sunlight peeked over the trees once more to search for the now 2 missing victims. The following morning, the search party set out once again and searched the now 2 lost souls in the unforgiving wilds around them. Though yet again the sun fell below the trees and there was still no sign of either the child or Josiah. This continued on for weeks, before the sheriff of the town decided that the odds of finding either victim alive was now slim to none, and the search party was called off, leaving the boy and the ranger never to be seen again. In their article, there was a photo of both the missing boy and of Josiah Elders. As I stare at the smiling face in the photo, it looks hauntingly familiar, the shoulder-length brown hair framing a pale face weathered by years in the sun and rain. It was unmistakably that of the figure I had seen in the woods up in my tower. With a deeply unsettling feeling seeming to rest like an anvil in my gut, I placed the worn, yellowed pages back in their homes and began to search for anything I could find regarding a missing woman in the recent past in the area. I began leafing through the most recent newspapers from the last few years for another hour or two until I found what I was looking for. A headline that announced the arrest of a local man in regards to an unsolved murder case that had taken place nearly a decade ago by the time this article had been penned. I pulled a small stack of papers out of the drawer they were housed in and set them on the large oak table that stood behind me. I began to scan through the article. It spoke of how 10 years before, a local woman had been found on one of the trails in the area, her body seemingly intact, save a large gash in her abdomen. The sheriff was called and an investigation ensued. This investigation began to lose steam only a few short days after the horrific discovery, as there was no real evidence that could link anyone to the heinous act. The most that could be gleaned from the site of the crime was the identity of the victim, who was a local woman in her mid-20s by the name of Isabel Thompson. She was a school teacher from the area that had been last seen 2 days prior by a local man when she was leaving the schoolhouse following the end of the week. Isabel had lived alone on the outskirts of town with only her cat to keep her company. She was known to her friends as someone who loved the outdoors and enjoyed going hiking alone up in the forest behind her home. This forest is where her lifeless body would be found, her insides exposed to the very mountain air that she had loved for so many years. The case regarding her killer stayed cold for years, with no real way of knowing who was responsible for cutting her young life short, until a local man in his mid-60s showed up at the sheriff's office one cool autumn evening. The man was a local to the area that had been a logger in the local timber company for longer than the sheriff had been alive. He explained to the sheriff that he had been diagnosed with a terminal cancer and did not have more than a few months left. He had decided that if he was going to pass away, he was going to do so with a clear conscience. He told the sheriff of how years ago he had been infatuated with a much younger woman, a local school teacher who had lived alone and enjoyed exploring the forest that he spent his life working in. He explained how he had followed her home one warm early summer afternoon. He sat outside her home, waiting for her to come out for her usual afternoon hike. As she had emerged from the front door of the small run-down old home, he approached her and began to introduce himself. She had stood there patiently, entertaining the older man's introduction, at which point she returned his niceties and inquired to his reasoning for stopping her on her way out. He explained his infatuation and attempted to make an advance on the much younger woman. She responded in her typical kind fashion, letting the man down lightly and hurrying past the stranger. This infuriated the man. He decided that he would not allow someone who he viewed as subservient, being something he was entitled to disrespect him so. In his hateful, twisted mind, he made the determination that the only solution was to cut the woman's life short. He returned to his home and spent the evening swimming in his vicious, self-indulgent thoughts. The following evening, he grabbed his hunting knife and set out into the dimming sky. He crept up the trail that led from the woman's home into the tree line, searching for her on her evening walk. He found her a mile up the trail on her way back down from the wilds, dressed in her hiking attire. He approached the young woman and without saying a word lunged at her, taking his knife from its sheath and cruelly cutting into her. He stood there, over her body as the life slowly drained from her once beautiful face, her blonde hair laying in waves on the ground around her. As she faded from the world that he had spitefully ripped her from, the man began back down the trail, content in his malice and the success he felt. Isabel was laid to rest, taken from a world that did not deserve her kindness too early. And as she was laid into the earth, the man responsible stood idly by, surrounded by those who had actually cared for her in life. As months turned to years, the man felt content in the assumption that he would not face the repercussions of the vile act he had committed. Almost 10 years passed, and the slaying had nearly faded out of the public eye, when the man noticed an innocuous lump on his neck. At first the man thought nothing of it and brushed it aside, though the lump continued to grow larger until it was an unsightly and painful nuisance. The man went to see the town's physician and was sent to the large city 2.5 hours away for further diagnostic procedures. The lump turned out to be a tumor that had grown on his thyroid and spread throughout his body. The man was informed that he was not long for this world and should get his affairs in order. Through some form of karmic justice, the forces that governed us had given him a fate worse than the one he had provided Isabel years ago. As his final days drew closer, he decided to come clean, leading to him sitting in the small windowless room he had found himself in weeks later. Following this information being divulged to the sheriff, the man was placed into a cell to await a trial date that would not arrive before his painful end. Next to the article sat another photo, that of Isabel Thompson. It showed her stunning features framed by her long blonde hair, seeming to cascade down her shoulders like a waterfall. Her face, though much happier and brighter in this photo, was unmistakably that of the woman I had seen in the woods from my cabin. I placed the pile of papers back onto the table in front of me and let out a long, deep sigh, pained by the fate of Isabel, Josiah, and the missing boy. As I returned the papers to their rightful places, I pushed the heavy wooden chair across the polished maple boards, leaving the room as I had found it. I walked back through the door into the library and thanked the older man again for his help. As I nudge my way through the front doors of the building, I am greeted by the soft evening air. I step into my truck, turn the key, and begin to trek back up into the darkness around me. My truck rolls to a stop at the base of the imposing silhouette of the fire tower in front of me. I venture out into the inky black night and towards my cabin. I close the door behind me with a quiet thud and begin to build a small fire in the fireplace. As the glow of the fire projects a dancing light around the interior of the cabin, painting it with a soft, comforting glow, I sit on my bed and begin to think about the information I had discovered today and what it could mean. The figures had obviously been those of the two people that had met an untimely end in these woods. The only question was why they were appearing to me now, after so many years watching over this expanse of uninhabited wilds. I sat up at the edge of my bed, not fully remembering when I fell asleep, though I must have done so at some point. I stand up and walk over the cool wooden floor toward the front door and slide my shoes on. As I step out into the warm sun, I am greeted by the familiar hum of the forest. I wander my way up the tower, soaking in the air that feels much less oppressive than the night prior. I reach the top of the stairs and begin my work, the whole while wondering if I would see the poor missing souls again tonight. The sun began falling toward the horizon, basking the woods in a soft orangish-pink glow. I sat at the railing of my tower, staring out at the endless expanse of rolling hills and mountains around me, reminded as I often was as to why I had not turned tail and fled yet. The sun finished its descent past the horizon, and the sky began to twinkle with the light of the stars, giving the woods a soft white glow. I began creeping down the tower, careful to preserve the relative stillness of the night air, in case there is any sound that might indicate one of the visages appearing in the trees. I reached the bottom of the stairs and am greeted with the two figures, standing as before, still just inside the tree line, though now joined by a much smaller figure. This new apparition is that of a young boy, his light blue shirt torn and dirty, though still acting as a pop of color in the swirling mass of shadows around him. His jeans equally worn and covered in mud. He looked as though he had been crawling through a bramble patch. As my gaze lifted to his face, I saw his eyes staring blankly back at me, the dried dirt underneath flowing like a river down his cheeks, acting as evidence that he had been crying. I'm frozen with the realization that this boy matches the image of the missing child Josiah had been seeking when he disappeared. Before I could move, the figures began to melt back into the black mass around them. I decided against pursuing them, knowing it was in vain. I step into my cabin and begin my normal nightly ritual, trying my best to shake the deep disease in my gut. I step to the railing of my tower in the cool morning air and contemplate if it is worth staying the remainder of the fire season at my post. Though these figures had not caused any harm to me yet, they carry a maleficent air to them, and I do not want to find out why. If they do wish to do me harm, they have not done so yet. And why have they not braved the clearing to reach me on such occasions like last night, when there was ample opportunity for them to strike? As I sat racking my brain, trying to remind myself of any warnings or odd statements my predecessor had given me years ago, my trance-like state is broken by a faint trail of smoke in the distance. I run inside and begin to sight the smoke on the firefinder that sat in the middle of the room. With the location sorted, I radioed the forest station and informed them of the fire. I sit and watch as the billowing cloud of black swirls and grows in the distance, taking up more and more of the sky. The fire begins to lick the tops of the trees as it crowns and runs across the hills, seeming to fly up the slopes around the valley it started in. As the sky darkens in the distance, I see a small speck of an airplane rushing in to aid in the fight against the growing beast. As the day wears on, the fire seems more constrained, as it had crested all the slopes around, and was being fought back as it struggled down the steep terrain on the other sides. The sun set, and the sky in the distance was glowing with a faint orange hue as the now partially contained fire looked for a way past the fire lines. As I reach the peak of my lookout, I am greeted by a comforting sight. The plume of black had grown smaller over the week since I had first spotted it, and the battle against the fire looked to be won. Having spent the last week of my life watching this inferno be beaten back to where it is now, I had almost completely forgotten the figures that had been haunting me. They had not shown themselves since the night before the fire began. I sit watching the writhing mass of smoke and flame slowly die as the sun arcs across the sky. The sun finishes its journey as the smoke in the distance shrinks to nothing. I step out to the edge of the platform and gaze down at the carpet of dark spires around me, the moonlight barely illuminating their peaks and casting long shadows into the clearing below. I admire the unsettling beauty of it for a moment and wind my way down the tower. As I step towards the cabin, I am frozen in place by movement out of my periphery. I turn my head to see the cause, and am greeted by the familiar sight of figures in the trees, though there has been another addition this time. My eyes lock with the new figure, and I am hit with a deep, unshakable confusion. I am seeing something that is impossible. Something that has made even the other beings seem perfectly mundane and reasonable. The eyes that I am locked onto are familiar. They are ones I have stared into innumerable times before. The person that stood in front of me was myself, wearing the very same clothes that I am wearing now. Every single thing about the figure is the same. It is me, no matter how impossible it may seem. I am standing in the trees looking back at myself. The trance-like state I am in is broken, and my feet act before my brain can catch up. I race toward the trees, desperately trying to reach this imposter before it melts away into the void around it. I watch as it disappears back into the woods. Right as I reach it, I can see the face of the entity. My face disfigure into a haunting, pained smile, my eyes running with tears as my body breaks and snaps in impossible ways and is dragged back into the mass of trees. I can no longer see myself, though I keep running, desperately trying to find answers. In my blind panic, I feel my foot catch on something unseen in the brush, and I begin to fall. As I open my eyes, I am greeted with a horror I cannot fully comprehend. My body is paralyzed. I cannot move, though I am standing in the trees. It is still dark, though I can see the fire tower. I'm standing in the tree line, and in front of me is the tower, though the lights are on. I'd left the tower's lights off before my mad dash into the trees. How were they on now? My vision shifted down, towards the cabin and my truck, which was gone, replaced instead with one that was completely unfamiliar to me. In a state of utter confusion and terror, I look back up towards the tower, having seen movement coming from the balcony around it. I see someone I had never seen before standing there, staring down at me. I try to call out, try to scream for help, but my voice won't work, my mouth won't move. I try to run to get to the light, and the safety this person may provide, but my legs are immobile, as if my body is not under my control. As I make this realization, I notice I am not alone in the tree line. I am joined by the figures of Josiah, Isabel, and the missing boy. They too stand immobile, gazing up at the man who is now running down the tower. He reaches the base and begins to sprint towards us. He even gets close enough for me to make out the color of his eyes, the deep green staring in horror at me before I feel myself begin to break and bend, causing unimaginable pain as my body is pulled by some force outside of my control back into the inky black night. My vision begins to go, as I see the man stop and begin to back away. Before I fully lose myself to the darkness around me, I try to tell the man to run, to never return to this place, so he may escape the fate I find myself in. The words don't escape my mouth. As the force that has pulled me out of reality wins, I feel my mouth tear into a smile, one that I do not control. The tears begin to stream, and my vision leaves me. The void is calling, and I must go.